Hi, everyone. My name is Savina Carluccio. I'm the Executive Director of the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. I am delighted to welcome you today. Welcome to you in the room. Welcome to everyone who's joined us online, and welcome to our speakers today. So the power sector will be the backbone for the future of net zero transport systems. And today we want to explore the clean energy, sustainable mobility nexus, and discuss how the barrier to innovation in energy and mobility entrepreneurship can be overcome, and we can identify initiatives that will have the potential to scale it up. So we will hear about 3 case studies of energy and mobility entrepreneurship and business models, followed by a roundtable discussion. The roundtable will be moderated by my colleague Andy Deacon, who is co-managing director for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Alex Makaliwa, director at TRIKE, who's going to give us a presentation about his work. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, and once more, welcome to everyone who's listening to me. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Could I please ask the tech team to have my presentation up? So just to provide context to what my thoughts are on this matter, I am very fortunate to lead a company called TRIKE. We also have a brand called Bike, and these are simply short for tricycle and bicycle, and we're operational in Kenya and currently piloting in the northwest of Kenya around Kakuma refugee camp, where I am presently at. So next slide, please. I think the important thing to highlight about the problem we're trying to solve is within rural off-grid Africa, the choices for mobility are very limited. You either are in a position where you have to head load and move product or produce over a number of kilometers, or alternatively, you can rely on local transport, which is often provided by motorcycle taxis or border borders, or there's matatus or a level of public transport. However, the mobility within this area is clearly very fragmented, and attached to the nature of how fragmented it is consequently quite expensive. And these are the 2 problems that TRIKE is itching to solve. Next slide, please. The way we're looking to solve that is twofold. On the one hand, we want to electrify mobility in the last and the first mile, which is largely serviced by conventional 2- and 3-wheelers. So these would be motorcycles and tuk-tuks. And when we electrify those, then we are able to give their operators access to an asset that is much cheaper to operate when you compare the cost of maintaining and charging an electric motorcycle versus the cost of fueling and maintaining the combustion engine counterpart. The second part of this is to digitalize and build a digital marketplace, if you will. The objective here would be to standardize transport quality, and also once we democratize access to transport, then hopefully the cost will go down. But of course, the difficulty with these logistics marketplaces is you then have 2 interests to serve. You have the operators who you have to promise that there'll be sizable pipeline to keep them within the platform, but also on the other side, you are trying to make sure that mobility is accessible, affordable, and because we're pushing electric mobility, that we want also transport within these rural areas, the first and the last mile, to be wholly sustainable. Next slide, please. Now, if I may speak briefly about the market that we're trying to solve. And initially, when we wanted to focus on rural off-grid communities, we are spending a lot of time asking ourselves what mobility demands there are in rural off-grid communities. And you cannot ignore the confluence between smallholder farming and rural environments. And as such, if you consider agricultural logistics as the area where we want to prove our concept in, there are approximately 2 million smallholder farmers. And we can even go further and articulate the people within this value chain. When you think of aggregators, when you think of people who sell inputs, for example, cold storage providers. And seeing as we're looking at a confluence between rural environments and smallholder farming, and we have already described the mobility options available to these people, we have approximately 1.2 million borders or motorcycle taxis in the country and growing. As such, when you consider the cost side for these smallholder farmers and traders, they're spending up to 30%, sometimes up to 50 or 60%. There's cases we've seen of up to 60% on the data that of 60% of their daily profits on logistics. And this is simply moving produce from their farms to local markets and moving inputs in the opposite way from local centers back to their farms. So it makes a lot of sense to try and tackle the logistics issue in this environment. And that's why there's three people we're trying to serve. There's the border or the motorcycle taxi operators, there's the smallholder farmers, and there are also the smallholder traders. And ultimately, if we can electrify the mobility assets that the border operators are using, and then create linkages between people who need a mobility service and people who have a mobility asset, then hopefully we can drive the costs down. And that is what Trike is scratching our heads and pulling out our hair trying to figure out. Next slide. But in the way of barriers, there's a couple. If there's some that I could highlight is we're in an interesting environment where transport is largely privatized, and this adds to the fragmented nature of mobility in this space. Ideally, this is a service that governments or administrations would be able to provide at various levels. But because transport, at least in Kenya, in this area, is largely privatized, then you have a big standardization issue. The way Trike is trying to approach that problem, of course, will be slightly different towards another organization. And as such, it can be difficult to find scale and solve the problem in a wholly similar manner. Also, the fact that we're introducing electric mobility needs us to think very carefully, and this was alluded to at the top of the session, needs us to think very carefully about access to electricity. And for the area that we're piloting, access to electricity is as low as 9%. Of course, there's various arguments about how we quantify and qualify access to electricity, but nonetheless, that is a major barrier. Now, another thing is what every entrepreneur says, and you speak to financiers and maybe other people at COP, well, financiers will tell you we have finance, but we don't have bankable projects. Then you have the opposite side of the table where, like myself, where we say we do have bankable projects, but not access to finance. And there's an opportunity to bring these two worlds together, especially leverage the idea of sustainable finance and bring the worlds of finance and bankable projects together. And this will be a massive benefit to all the stakeholders. Next slide, please. But also there's wonderful opportunities that we can have. Of us who are familiar with the implementation of electric mobility, especially in emerging markets, there is the clarion call that electric motorcycles and electric three-wheelers are cheaper to operate, and this has largely been proven. However, there is a pending plateau on how much you can leverage from simply reducing the cost, and that's why Trike has to focus on not on purely reducing OPEX, but also increasing profitability. And that's why you will remember that I made mention that we have to make sure that the people on our platforms have better pipeline and therefore can grow their revenues while still keeping the operational expenditure related to their assets quite low, and then we can impact profitability. Now, also, there's great debate between what makes sense, charging vehicles or swapping batteries. And this, again, is an impending standardization bottleneck, where very quickly, with the help of government and other bodies, we can agree on what the standard is going to be. Because you have Alex, my motorcycles use a particular battery dimension, a particular voltage of the system, and that varies with another startup. To give a scale of the problem, I think within Eastern Africa, you have close to 40 electric mobility companies, and a situation where each company has its own motorbike, its own platforms, its own charging infrastructure. Very quickly, you'll get to a standardization nightmare. And that is something that we need to think about within our business models to make sure that the uptake of our solutions is not compromised. The last is something that I am very passionate about, especially being in the environment within which we are. And that is to make sure that our business models are as inclusive as possible. The motorcycle operators who we target, the smallholder farmers who we target, were often in cooperatives. And we push for farmers who are in groups because then we have the opportunity to really leverage utilization of our products. If we can innovate around the business models and make sure that they are not simply recipients of technology, but they are also co-builders of that technology, if we can create a level of ownership and financial remuneration through those business models, then I think we are really building the blocks that can encourage the uptake of such important and timely solutions. Next slide, please. As ever, if there's anything that I have said rings a bell with you, then we'd be delighted if you can reach out to spur the conversation, help us mark and poke holes into our vision, build into what we're trying to develop here in Kenya and across Africa. You're more than welcome to reach out, and you can do so using those social media handles or using our phone numbers or email addresses. But nonetheless, that is it from Trike, and I look forward to the discussions for the next hour. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Alex. That was really interesting, and thank you for sharing your experience and your insights on business models, barriers, and how to overcome them. My next speaker, I'm really pleased to introduce you to Bryn Lindblad, Deputy Director of Climate Resolve. She's going to give a presentation that has got more of a transport focus about cool streets. Over to you, Bryn.
All right. Good afternoon. As Savina said, I'm Bryn Lindblad, Deputy Director of Climate Resolve. We are a civil society organization based in Los Angeles, California. Focused on advancing practical, equitable solutions to climate change. And we focus on both climate adaptation and mitigation. So I'll be talking to you today about cool streets, which maybe is something new to you, but I think it's something that holds a lot of promise. An overview of my presentation, I'll start by kind of explaining why cool streets, why we're so into this idea, how we've gotten to where we are today, and then where we see it headed next. A bit about Los Angeles. We are a land of cars, unfortunately. It's our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and pollution from these vehicles is hurting our respiratory health. So it's really something we need to do something about. We're pretty determined to fix this. We are doing things like, it turns out people like their cars because they like these air-conditioned bubbles that take them where they want to go. So we're trying to do things to make that situation more appealing to people to get out of their cars. And it gets quite hot in Los Angeles, and it's getting hotter, right? With the climate change, we're expecting the number of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 Celsius to double or triple within the next 20 years. So it's something we can't ignore. We need to, of course, stop going on that trajectory of warming days, but there's also some adaptation work we can do to be cooling down our urban environment. So we're doing things like installing bus shelters at transit stops, but there's other measures to really cool down urban temperatures. We have quite an urban heat island in Los Angeles, and our biggest culprit, adding a lot of unnecessary heat, is the asphalt that's coating our streets. These darker surfaces are absorbing sunlight and then re-radiating it as heat all day, all night long, and adding anywhere from up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in air temperature to our city that doesn't need to be that way. So what we're doing about it, wherever we can, take out some pavement, add in green infrastructure. Evapotranspiration helps to cool down our urban environment. But we're also, we've learned some lessons along the way. Los Angeles had a history of planting these picturesque little palm trees, but they don't add a lot of shade or cooling to our urban environment. So now, kind of done are the days of planting those little palm trees and trying to get more robust shade trees and tree canopy cover out there. We have to start somewhere, and it's our lowest income, most historically marginalized neighborhoods that are the hottest and could really use cooling interventions. But what we found is when we plant saplings in those neighborhoods, the scorching heat doesn't allow those trees to grow to be big, thriving, healthy, large tree canopy. So we need to help them out a little bit. And so in comes cool streets, cool pavement, which is a more reflective coating for our streets that reflects the sunlight rather than absorbing it and radiating it as heat. And we found that it can reduce air temperatures 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit cooler compared to traditional blacktop streets. We got this idea. We started with cool roofs. In 2014, Los Angeles was the first city in the US to pass a cool roof mandate. All new roofs should be reflective. And that was an easier sell. People could save money on their electricity bills, not having to pump the air conditioning as much. And within a couple years of that mandate, roofs are getting replaced so frequently that the sheer volume of new roofs drove down the cost of that product. So it's now the cost is on par with traditional roofing materials. So now we've taken to the streets and trying to create cool corridors, which is really our biggest culprit of urban heat. The public health benefits, student learning benefits. The benefits are numerous to trying to cool down our city, but a lot of those benefits aren't realized in economic terms so much. So it's a little bit more of a challenge now to be getting investments in cool streets. You can see we've seen some of the effectiveness of these interventions from space. That's a thermal image from a satellite. It's helped us make the case that we can make a difference. A brief history of some of the phases of Los Angeles' cool pavement program. It's still quite an infant industry in the U.S. Tokyo is the place of anywhere in the world that has the most advanced cool pavement program. Los Angeles and Phoenix are tied, I'd say, for first in the U.S. of trying to advance this. But really, as we've gone along, we've increased in scale the projects that we've done, and we find the larger and the more holistic projects that we do, the bigger the impact. As you can see, cool pavement comes in all different colors. We've implemented pilot projects along the way to really make the case and show proof of concept. We've invited sustainability directors from across the country to come see and feel the difference. And that's led us to developing a cool roadways partnership. So we have over 20 cities in the US that have said over the next 10 years they could invest in over 70,000 lane miles of pavement, value nearly $5 billion, if the industry could develop a product that's really even more durable and cheaper is the big thing. So trying to incentivize industry to give us a good product, an even better product. And now, so we got into cool surfaces for the cooling benefits, but now we're trying to uplift yet another benefit of these more reflective surfaces, and that's solar forcing. But these more reflective surfaces, when sunlight comes in, that radiation is reflected back as light rather than getting the chance to convert into heat and long-wave radiation. And that light then doesn't get trapped by greenhouse gases. It ends up back in space. So there's this climate change mitigation benefit, right, of reducing the greenhouse effect. And so along those lines, we are in the midst of developing a carbon credit methodology based on that solar forcing benefit of these reflective surfaces to try to really tap into private capital to bring these multi-benefit resilience projects to scale and ultimately lower the cost for even broader deployment. So thank you, and I have a handout for anyone who's interested on the concept. You're welcome to take with you.
Thank you, Bryn, and thanks. It's quite inspiring. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'm introducing now my final speaker for this part of the session. I'm introducing you to Pavan Mukulukla, Program Director, Clean Mobility and Energy Tech, World Resource Institute, India. He's going to be talking to us about transforming public transport in India with e-buses.
Thank you, and a very good afternoon to everyone. I'm just going to talk about an interesting initiative in India on electric buses and how we have taken a systems approach to really transforming many cities at a time, which could become a replicable business model. The key message is we need more buses, more electric buses. We are talking about needing at least close to 350,000 buses, and we have only about 140,000. And this is actually the public transport, because this is the only way that people can travel in many of the cities. So their livelihoods, their jobs, access to education, health, literally depends upon buses. And what we have seen is India is also committed to EV30 at 30. So at least 22% of this 370,000 buses that we need by 2030 need to be electric. And how are we really going to achieve that? And that has been the core of our conversation over the last couple of years on making this actually happen in India. And of course, we are signatory to our commitment at Glasgow at COP26, where we said, announced our climate commitment, and also about how do we really reduce the fossil fuel bills, because if you see, we have gone from 96 million, almost 15 years back, to 8 billion in 2015 in importing oil to keep our transport sector alive. And air pollution, many of the cities in India have heavy pollution, and in fact, this is a time where we are even experiencing this. So what do we really do about it? And of course, a large growth in private vehicles that we have seen over the last couple of years. But what has happened? So far, we have now deployed 2,800 electric buses in more than 20 cities. And how are we really doing this? As I already mentioned, most of this are public transport agencies and not private operators. So these are public operators. So they have this obligation of providing services across multiple cities. And given that they can't really change their fare price as they wish, and they're mandated by regulations, it becomes even more of a challenge on how do you really make it even financially or economically viable without any viability gap, funding support, or anything from the government. Electric buses, we all know they are almost 2 to 3 times expensive than your diesel buses. And how would we really pay for this? And this is where the innovation has really come, that how we have changed from owning assets or owning buses to really converting our contracts and agreement on pay as you use. So we are really talking of electric buses as long-term investment projects, and we are deploying lease which are almost 12 years long, and this is how really you then get the benefit on pay per kilometer use that you charge instead of paying upfront capital costs to really achieve this. What did we do actually? 2 things to really change the entire business model. One is we said the national government launched this mission, but 2 things they did. One is that any city which was eligible for the funding will only have to do the pay as you use model. So there was nothing about purchasing buses, it was going to be leasing the buses. So that was one system or the rules where we changed. The second thing that we have done is to say, instead of every city procuring their own buses individually, we are saying, can we aggregate at the national level procurement so that your supply chain has clear access to know how many buses can they really buy? So instead of one city saying we'll buy 50 buses, 200 buses, 300 buses, we are saying let's do 5,000 buses at one time, 10,000 buses, and this is how we are doing our contracting process. These two systems have really led to, this is the price reduction. For the very first time, we are seeing almost 27% price reduction compared to your diesel buses. So electric buses, which were seen as unaffordable and which were very high, the price just crashed because the market really responded. And the first tender that was put out was for 5,500 buses, and that really brought down the prices drastically. And this then made every city to think, do we really need to buy buses? Do we even need to buy diesel and CNG buses? Which is a great model to really start thinking about and how this transformation is happening in India. And just to give you, the green lines represent the numbers that we have discovered from this aggregation of 5,000 buses. And if you see all the cities, they were purchasing and procuring these buses at a very high price. But with this new business model, you have seen that the prices have just come down significantly. What does this price reduction mean? It means almost saving of $1.2 billion over the life of 12 years of a bus. And this really is extremely important because for a cash-strapped public transport agency, how do we really start thinking innovatively to do this? And because of this, what has it done to the ecosystem? I think that's the beautiful story, that from 5,000 buses, now the government of India has set a target that how do we really move to 50,000 buses nationwide in the next 5 to 7 years. And for me, this is really the kind of transformation that we would like to see really happen, because till now we were always saying that, let's get some buses here, some buses there, really plan for their routes and help them with operation and maintenance. But now we are saying that, hey, come on, let's change the rule of the system. Let's see how do we really look at it very differently. And this model is something I strongly feel is replicable in many other global south countries where bus-based public transport becomes really important, and where even cities are thinking to transform from informal transport to public transport. I think this model would really work. And finally, some estimates. We're also talking about how do we ensure that the electricity supply is renewable energy based. So now we have also parallelly put out a tender that we are saying that while all the cities are procuring, can we actually have their own off-grid installation where they can talk to the utility companies and get RE energy, because the renewable energy is literally available, I think, at 10 cents per kilowatt hour per unit. That's the cost. It's so cheap in India. How do we really leverage the solar and wind, which we have already achieved our target for 2022, 175 gigawatt of RE installation, which we are very close to it. How do we really use that towards actually charging our electric buses? So that's another intervention that we are really bringing into this. See, I think it's very important when we are talking about public transport to ensure that there is linkage to jobs, there is a linkage to savings. It's not just only about service, because unless we bring that narrative into our conversation, it becomes very difficult. Otherwise, you see that, some buses are being deployed. So we are talking about job calculation, we are talking about emission reduction, and we are giving a clear signal to the manufacturing, because that has been a big ambition of the Prime Minister of India to make India a manufacturing hub. So how do you do that with all this local manufacturing happening? So I think that's the conversation that we are talking about. So yeah, quite exciting times, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pawan. That was a great success story, and it shows that a transformation is possible, but also makes sense. So thank you. Thank you so much for this. So it's time to move to the roundtable part of our session. And I'm handing over now to Andy to moderate the discussion. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, colleagues, and good afternoon. For those of you who haven't worked out where you are, welcome to the Resilience Hub. you join us partway through this discussion. You've heard now from 3 speakers, from Alex, Bryn, and Pawan, but I'm going to give the rest of the panel a moment to introduce themselves and throw them a soft starter question. But then we'll start to open things up to the floor to engage all of you. We've got a fantastic diversity both of experience, expertise, and views in the room. We're hoping everybody's not going to violently agree with one another, and that we get a little bit of debate and discussion going as well, in particular with a view to thinking about how entrepreneurship plays a role at local level in delivering on energy transition and transport. I was very impressed with all 3 of those examples and the way in which they very clearly had identified a solution to a local problem, and were then seeking to scale it up and expand it, and to build really beyond just local markets and to take those solutions much broader. And really, so I'm a representative from the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. We were founder members of the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, and have been very keen to continue working with them. And one of the issues and challenges that mayors of smaller secondary and tertiary cities face is being able to take solutions and both attract finance for them, as we heard, to really scale them up and be able to deliver and have them play a part as part of their climate action planning and solutions. So I'm going to start at this end, my left, just so Sophia's ready. Come over there and we'll work our way along. So Sophia, please introduce yourself and just say a little bit. We'll start by identifying some of the barriers and kind of opening those up and getting those out there. Tell me a bit about, kind of what you think some of the key barriers facing entrepreneurs in this kind of space are on the basis of your work for DAI.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all the panelists. I think it's been just great. I have a few speaking points, but now I feel like I'm going to speak about something else because it's been really inspiring. And thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure being here. My name is Sofia Martinez. I work for DAI. It's a global consultancy company, and I'm part of the global climate business team. We take climate really seriously in DAI, and it's one of our priorities. And I'm a principal specialist on energy and climate. I'm very glad that you are moderating this session. I'm very familiar with the Covenant of Mayors, and from what we've heard, local action is fundamental. So the barriers on access to climate finance for entrepreneurs at the local level, I think it's one of the key issues that need to be tackled for them to grow and to achieve the different business models and to achieve sustainability. So for me, 2 key barriers are capacity building and access to local finance. The 3 examples we've seen, it's clear that this can be solved, but the solutions depends on each situation. And then is the conversation between public and private at local level and national level. Sometimes there is a disconnection there, so I think it's also something that really needs to be addressed. And also supporting local value chains. That it's really difficult to have networks, strong networks working on energy efficiency or renewable energy at the local level. Compared with other sectors, there's the small MVT in the room, so it's difficult for them. So I don't know if you want me to go further into any of these things, or I'll stop here.
No, thank you. That's great for a first round of introduction. Obviously, we're going to come back in a few minutes and talk about how to overcome some of those barriers. So if you didn't bring your checkbook with you, if you can already start thinking about some sources of finance. And I know we work very closely with DAI colleagues in delivering the Secretariat for the Global Covenant of Mayors, but perhaps some of those mechanisms to help build capacity. Great. Next, to my immediate left, I'm going to turn over to Mohammed, who's from the, or is working on transport here, or in Cairo, here in Egypt. Again, tell us a little bit about what you see as the key barriers to kind of entrepreneurial solutions in the particular context here in Egypt around the situation with regards to transport and energy. Over to you.
Absolutely, thank you. So my name is Hegazi. I represent Transport for Cairo, and we are a strategic advisory consultancy based in Cairo, Egypt. But we have a portfolio of more than 50 projects under our belt across 6 countries in Africa. And our focus is really public transport within urban mobility systems, within cities, which is dominated by informal transport. So Cairo, for instance, has 2/3 of a system informal. And if you go across Africa, sometimes it's up to 85%, if not the entire system. And when we talk about the barriers to entrepreneurship, I'll say flip the coin upside down. This entire system is highly entrepreneurial. It's highly entrepreneurial because it's more about employment generation than it is about moving people from A to Z. So these are people who find a way to create their own employment. Often it is, as Alex mentioned, from Nigeria, it's about buying boda bodas, the first job that people get entering a labor market in a city, which is a motorcycle taxi, upgrading to an auto rickshaw, upgrading to a taxi, all the way to a microbus or a minibus. It's across the value chain of the service provision. And once we figured out the employment generation part, then service provision comes in, and it's all entrepreneurial in how they manage it. So for me, the real question is resilience and energy, because these are why it brings us here today. And if I might talk about resilience, like there is obviously an element of being able to keep providing service, especially in the face of disruption. Often disruption is social, particularly now with the increase in oil prices and the lifting of subsidies. How can I continue operating with the higher cost? Who bears this cost? Is it the driver or is it the passengers? And you often see, especially in Cairo, a conflict. Prices are fixed by cabinet, but then subsidies are removed, and then the drivers are squeezed. They try to increase prices before cabinet reacts, but then there is a mutiny in the back of every car. So that's an issue of resilience. It's economic resilience. And I'll stop here because we'll have a long conversation ahead of us.
No, great, thank you. And we will come back to you to talk about some of the work that you're doing to overcome some of those barriers, problems, and issues in the next round of questions. Great. Then I'm going to turn to my right now and hand us over, staying with a focus on Egypt, then to Abdul Rahman from You Think Green. Tell us a little bit about the organization and about some of the barriers and challenges that you, in developing the organization, are facing.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Abdurrahman Fahmi. I'm a managing partner of You Think Green Egypt. We're a sustainable development consulting house focusing on Egypt, but also working recently on an African level. We run an incubator and accelerator for clean tech startups for more than 4 years in partnership with Climate Kick and the European Institute for Technology and Innovation. And we work with a lot of entrepreneurs and startups, not necessarily only on mobility, but also in energy and adaptation solutions as well. And I would name actually 3 barriers that is very common to see in the entrepreneurial system in Africa. Number 1 is definitely the regulations. We are talking about the mobility and energy transition. Both topics are highly controlled by the public entities and also highly intervened in by the public entities. So regulations in countries, and we can get into details the more we speak, is highly affecting the innovation in the mobility sector. The infrastructure and the local infrastructure, whether the access to electric chargers, access to bike lanes, or different mobility and energy infrastructure is highly impacting also the startups and the way they are operating. Number 3 is the technology and access to technology. Also working in developing countries, and maybe this is the case in Egypt, but much more severely in Africa, access to mitigation technologies and clean tech technologies are usually very high priced. So those are the 3 main barriers. I would claim that climate finance is an issue worldwide, that's for sure. But mitigation solutions usually don't face the same challenges faced by adaptation solutions. Adaptation solutions are in deep crisis when it comes to finance. However, from an experience, usually there is a lot of financial mechanisms that's supporting renewables, supporting mobility, logistics, transportation, rather than adaptation solutions and resilience. So I would say regulations, number 1, infrastructure, number 2, and technology, number 3. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Professor Preeti Parikh. I'm a professor in infrastructure engineering and international development at University College London, and I'm also a council member for Institution of Civil Engineers. The big picture here is energy access by itself, benefits 143 out of 169 SDG targets. So access to energy, therefore, is fundamental for a just transition. I'm going to draw parallels from my work in the energy space because I think there are parallels around barriers, challenges, and opportunities from the solar energy space in Africa to transport. So my observation is, in my work with industry where they provide solar home systems to the last mile users, the challenge is those are in very remote locations. So how do you get to those users? The second challenge is this is a base of pyramid model where you're dealing with a large number of users who will use very small amounts of electricity, or they will make very few trips. So how do you use digital technologies to look at demand management so you can provide the right transportation or the right services to them at right points in time? Access to finance is another barrier, but within that there are multiple layers to it. One is for the service provider, how do they raise finance to, say, set up a model similar to what Pavan described in his presentation. But equally, at the household level, if you have informal economy, farming, if you do not have fixed monthly incomes, how do you pay for those services in a way which is affordable, which is manageable for you, so you can pay school fees, you can deal with festivals. So access to finance, I think, is a big barrier, and it is quite nuanced and complicated at multiple levels for multiple stakeholders.
Thank you. So we've had a view that access to finance isn't necessarily a problem, but that it is. But it depends whether you're looking at resilience and adaptation. Maybe, although you suggested that even for solar energy, then it can be a barrier. But nobody wants to be in a session that focuses only on where the barriers and blockers are. So we'll come to solutions in a second. But first, Alex is still with us behind me. Alex, Bryn, Pawan, anything further that you wanted to add on problems before we try to fix them?
Sure. I'll add, I think in our case, it was really understanding like the root of the problem, like why people weren't taking transit and using active modes of transportation. And so we talked to people, we asked people, and we found out heat was really behind that. People didn't want to show up sweaty somewhere, right? And the next thing I'd say is kind of only maybe using like one tool in the toolbox and stopping there and hoping that would cut it. We need to keep going further and kind of keep figuring out more tools to urban cooling to be helping out our greenery. Maybe the last barrier I'll mention was, I mentioned a couple times, but the cost of an infant industry product. Until we are able to bring things to scale, it's a niche product like that is going to be pricier than our government wants to pay. So a couple ideas of how we could lower that cost.
No, super, thank you. And spoiler alert, there's a question coming later on how we scale up. So I'm going to come back to you specifically on that one. Okay, so then we've heard about barriers on access to finance, about regulation, about underlying infrastructure, about the ability or not to scale. But then what's needed to support entrepreneurs from the national level, from the local level? How do we bring public and private sectors together? Sophia, you suggested that you might have a few solutions maybe to get us started. From some of your very varied project experience, any that spring to mind? Are there any kind of trailblazers that you talk about? And kind of what particular solutions have they managed to implement?
Thank you. I wish I have the solution, but I think we've heard 3 really good cases that barriers can be overcome, and it's a mix of solutions. Unfortunately, there is no one size for everyone. There is no one solution for everyone. So it has to be adapted to the local level. I think that understanding the local needs begins with a platform for a dialogue with the private sector, with the civil society, and with the public sector. I think this type of approaches that in some cases have been taken in the context of the just transition is really useful. You bring all the stakeholders together to the table because sometimes they are speaking different languages, although they understand that they are facing the same barriers, but they don't really talk to each other. And projects like the Covenant, the Global Covenant of Mayors, and then the regional covenants in the Mediterranean region or in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, that one is not with DAI, but it's really important having this type of dialogues and also including and promoting capacity at all levels. You need to involve all the ministries. It's not the ministry for, rural planning. It will depend on each country. You will also need to involve the trade ministry, employment, and education. I think that education is one of the main gaps also in accessing climate finance. Local banks, they need to understand. I don't remember who has mentioned that the technologies are expensive. Sometimes the technologies are expensive because the financiers, they don't understand the business models. And that's why they perceive that they are too risky. So promoting this type of dialogues is just enhancing. And it might seem as a simplistic solution, but it's a complex process that requires the engagement of the various stakeholders, that it really can make the difference. We've seen it with several projects that we are running in Egypt, Palestine, Turkey, or the covenants, just to name a few, and I think it's a good example. And of course, I could provide further details on the project, and you can also Google DAI or ask to me directly. But I think these little things are really important. And one thing I really want to mention, I mentioned just transition, and for that, we also need to empower women and youth. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And we have good examples also in Mexico and here in Egypt, because Mediterranean and Arab women are really, really something, and it's really working. So yeah, thank you.
Then thank you. Maybe I'll come to one of the colleagues working in Egypt. Maybe you want to kind of say something also that builds on that, just around the kind of support that you're looking to provide to enable entrepreneurs to overcome some of those barriers that we mentioned previously.
Absolutely. So my first question would be, who are the entrepreneurs that we're talking about? I'm subscribed to this newsletter, and it brings me all of the entrepreneurs that raised $5 and $10 and $15 million. They exist. But for me, an entrepreneur is the 20, 50,000 individual auto entrepreneurs, the ones that go and get a car and start operating it, or the ones that hopefully in the future will build in a wall charger in their house to start offering charging services, which can be a democratization of access to energy rather than the fuel Tankstelle, they would say in German petrol stations that we have now, which are more centralized. So once you think that the entrepreneurs are like these micro entrepreneurs that are providing micro level services in the informal economy, then the question is, how do they work now to how do we want to change them? Now, for me, the target is clear. We want to make them resilient to multiple different kinds of shocks, be them environmental shocks, but also economic shocks. We tend to forget those. COVID was a huge economic shock, and we're living with its repercussions until now. And to do that, we need to think about how we can bring finance to scale the entire value chain, and not just the 10, 15% of the formal economy, but the entire informal economy. So how do we fit into their dynamics? Now, they're based on remittances. That's a big source of financing. And remember, the Boda Bodas, the microbuses, they're self-financed. They are independent of government finance in a lot of situations. And we have seen in our work a process of financialization. That is banks entering. That is rather than I get my life savings to buy a car and rent it out on a day-by-day basis, to I take a loan, buy a motorcycle and start operating it and take the commercial risk. Which takes me to what ought to be done. What is our role here? I think it's about data. It's about leveraging the power of digital to open things that weren't possible before through three mechanisms. The first is market access management. In public transport, in informal transport, you often have oversupply. So by managing the entrance to market, managing that supply matches demand and is not double it, you guarantee revenues and you make the operations bankable. This is related to the second part, which is network management. My company maps public transport systems. We get to see the 600 routes that constitute the invisible network of Cairo. And by matching vehicles to these networks, market access demand, you can start giving them more advanced licenses. That's where the regulation comes in, and make them bankable for a bank to give them credit. I know that you'll be operating every day and your revenue is guaranteed. And this is what takes us to FICO scores, credit scores. You can start opening credit scores that make it bankable to international finance to come in, and the only thing that's missing from international finance are the risks that are beyond anybody's control in my society. Exchange rate risk and political risks. And these are the ones that international finance and international support, development support, can mitigate, allowing 10 and 50x of private finance to come in and to really put a target. Let's move 50,000 of these microbuses to a resilient electric system.
Fantastic. And kind of very pinpoint accuracy just in terms of some of those key barriers. And totally agree with you on both the points you made about decentralization, which we're definitely seeing as a key part of the kind of future energy system in multiple regions. Pawan, let me come back to you because it seemed that some of the work that you were doing was starting to overcome some of those kind of scaling challenges. Tell us a little bit more about kind of what really unlocked that success.
I think most of it has been covered, but 2-3 points that I wanted to mention is, I think the way governments have been doing their contracts, because the conditions in contracts always encourage the established players, right? We don't really talk about onboarding an entrepreneur to solve our problems. So I think that has been, for example, in India, the lowest bidder will win the contract. That's the criteria. So how do we then change these things? Because that's the only way you will be able to encourage entrepreneurs to come in. So what we have been doing is also to facilitate this matchmaking between entrepreneurs and the transit agencies, working with funding support from donors who are really willing to put that seed money in this kind. So that's one way to do it. The other way is, I think most of us in Global South will agree that we face a lot of issue with data. because none of these agencies are willing to give data. So one way to really also bring in new models, new services is to really say, let's put out data that is in public domain, because that will really put, you'll see hundreds of entrepreneurs really start developing something. And the last point I want to make is, we don't really need actually very capital intensive and very big solutions. We really need to make those simple shifts that we can scale up, and will really bringing customer at the center of what we want to achieve will really help us solve problems. So I think these are some of the thoughts I have. Thank you.
No, great. Thank you very much. And again, back to the decentralization, the localization, and even the kind of micro scale solutions, and kind of really interesting to hear that was helpful. Alex, to come to you, back on screen behind us all, anything that you want to add on what you think are some of the key steps towards solutions from your point of view?
And I can stress two things. The first has already been mentioned, and this is education. We desperately need to make sure that we're building capacity, and not just in the maintenance of these devices, but also in the design of some of these components. There's going to be need to have local expertise in the design and assembly of battery packs, in the way these things are repaired, in the way motors are repaired. So having that local capacity is important, and you will clearly see the need for that, not even in the thousands, even within the hundreds. So the threshold to reach a clear indication of local capacity that is needed is important. I'll also stress at Strathmore University, there's been the implementation of this course called Energy for Financiers. So I 100% agree. Sometimes the people writing the checks do not entirely understand the intricacies of the project, and of course that has a bearing. And I say that both ways. So I am an entrepreneur who's trying to understand finance also. So it's not simply for the finance people to move to us. It's also for us to understand the finance world, so that together we can build a credible solution. And possibly the last thing is, with regards to financing, there's the local border network in Kenya. You could estimate their revenues to be up to 1 billion shillings daily, when you consider 1 million plus borders and the revenues that they're getting a day. So when we speak of local financing, when you speak of inclusive business models, when we try and leverage this table banking and Harambe and cooperative mentality that is prevalent in some areas of the continent, and I believe that's another lever that we can push to really hone the local capacity and finance to make sure that solutions are being driven from the bottom up.
Great. Thank you so much for those perspectives. Preeti, let me come back to you. Education got a mention there, and obviously some of your work focused on kind of higher education work around some of this key underlying infrastructure that we've talked about. Kind of better education on energy for financiers works one way, but then also how about access to finance for those who are developing infrastructure projects? Tell us a bit more about how your work is overcoming some of those barriers, and just around how we bring those two different communities closer together.
Thank you. So the partnership I have is with private sector. So it's quite interesting to have this synergy and partnership between academia and the private sector. And what the private sector is doing fabulously well is they are reaching the last mile. They are installing solar panels, battery boxes, they are providing electricity. What is fascinating is the amount of electricity those households use is similar to me switching on a light bulb in London for 5 hours. That's their consumption. And we have a huge customer base at that level of consumption. In the future, this is going to increase rapidly. So the type of questions we are dealing with is, in the future, what would be the appliances? What would be the needs? Will the users want a shaver? Will they want a radio? will want to television. What are the next appliances which are going to be hot off the press? Because those appliances need to be energy efficient. But the excitement there is both on the financing models, and I don't want to talk about access to finance because I kicked up a fuss that it's a big barrier. Finance is a barrier at both ends. So if you're private sector, the typical traditional model for energy, and I think for transport so far, has been you purchase the asset, whether it's buses, whether it's the solar panels, and you provide a service. Or you purchase the asset and you charge the households for the cost. Now, for the last mile users in resource challenge settings, they cannot pay for the cost of asset, which means the entrepreneur has to purchase and bear the cost up front. So that's why they need venture capital funding, they need green finance, they need climate finance, so they can purchase the asset to deliver a service, whether it's transportation or electricity. But once that service has been delivered, there needs to be models so that the consumers, users, can simply tap on their phone and they can access electricity or they can use public transportation. This is called a pay-as-you-go model. So with the pay-as-you-go model, you can use as you go along, but even that's not enough. So we've been doing machine learning modeling on electricity consumption for people in remote villages in Africa. We pretty much sitting in London know when they switch on a light bulb in Rwanda. Now, what those models are showing us is there are some people who cannot afford to pay per use as well, but they can pay in weekly or monthly patterns, and there are customers, clusters and patterns and subgroups. So even within that, we're finding that there needs to be more data, there needs to be kind of digital kind of monitoring to find those subgroups and customize models even more within the pay-as-you-go space.
Great, thank you very much. I want to come back to Bryn because access to data, got to mention. I'll give you literally 20 seconds just to say something. I mean, I noticed your work kind of trying to use geospatial data, but kind of that works very well in your particular context. Have you explored kind of options to expand kind of access to that kind of data to support the expansion and scaling of your work?
Yeah, so I showed an image of satellite data. We've also done mobile transect data to take measurements at the 2-meter height, somewhere person level, air temperature. And that data has really been effective to show policymakers, officials, how we can make a difference and try to kind of use that to communicate with the public also to build momentum for the sort of demand change that we can do better. And yeah, I think those are sort of the main ways data has played a role. Would love to see research institutions play a larger role in research and development and help kind of innovate the product. We've been leaning a lot on industry to do that so far. So an example I'll give, the first cool pavements that hit the streets were a lighter color. And we found the public thought they got dirty too quickly, kind of thought they got ugly. And so it's innovated since then to be a kind of a more neutral color gray. And that's something that we've relied on industry to keep up with those public demands.
Thank you very much. Always good to listen to feedback from the customer base as well. Very good. Let me come back to you finally. I missed you out in that round. Since we're here in Egypt, very quickly, kind of anything you want to offer in terms of solutions that are helping entrepreneurs in the energy and transport space scale rapidly.
Yeah, sure. If you asked any entrepreneur how we can help you, definitely the answer will be money. But aside from this, what we actually strongly believe in Youth in Green, and this is the main mission that we do, is that we help transform the ecosystem towards more sustainable approaches. And by ecosystems, we mean access to finance, business linkage, value chain integration, access to data, communication with policymakers and regulators, awareness and civil society engagement, education and higher research and development. This is what we are trying to do, not only in the mobility or the energy sector, but also in circular economy and agriculture and different things. But I think the way to support entrepreneurs is building resilient ecosystems, supportive ecosystem, including the private sector, who could be the clients of such innovations, including the government, including the civil society, the beneficiaries, and also including the awareness and marketing and communication. By that, I think we are supporting the sustainability of any innovation we are talking about. Beside definitely the money. Money is the main driver for any innovation to withstand economic crisis and withstand research and development and so on. But a very collaborative and supportive ecosystem from different players is the best place for innovations to grow and scale beyond national borders as well, in similar ecosystems. So I think this is what we are trying to do, and from our perspective, this is something to support entrepreneurs critically.
Thank you so much. I'll just wrap up by saying I think we've started building a wonderful innovation ecosystem with this panel. We've got a number of different perspectives, sectors, geographies represented. I would agree access to finance is key. Hopefully you've heard a bit about solutions as well as barriers. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to come to questions from the floor, but please come and badger all of our panelists afterwards. I'm sure they'd love to handle follow-up questions. We could have kept going for much longer. Thank you to Savina, to Gemma, and all of the team involved with the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. The organization is relatively new, but looking to scale and grow rapidly and in multiple areas of the world. If you want to know more about them, please go and engage with them. Would encourage you to look at the materials and resources that ICSI are making available and to continue these discussions to really drive forward the importance of the local level in anything else that you do through the remainder of this week. Thank you all very much and enjoy your next session. Thanks.